or a true or condition, where that would either be data-driven or event-driven. A lot of times when people refer to sometimes or it depends, they're actually talking about an inclusive gateway, which again can be a combination of a parallel activity with an exclusive gateway. One of the key things, I think, as we were wrapping up at the end of last session, the question about whether you should use a gateway or not, I wanted to reiterate that BPMN as a notation is a very rich language, but there are multiple ways to say or model the same thing and have the same meaning. So whether or not you use a gateway really can vary your meaning or understanding of your process model. And again, going back to Bruce Silver's foundation, the whole purpose of using a standardized notation is to drive clear and concise understanding between people who are looking at the same model. So I want you all to be very conscious of, if you do not use a gateway when you are talking about a split, if you look in the upper right of my screen, these two process models mean exactly the same thing. The one at the top uses the gateway, the one on the bottom does not. So when you're talking about a split, it's the same thing as an AND condition. However, if you're not using a gateway when condition flow is merging into an activity, it's the same thing as using an OR condition. So I want you to be very cautious about it. In the bottom of my screen here on the right, you can see that the box on the top is probably not really correct. You would not buy a house until all three of the activities had completed, rather than buying a house 3 times. And that's what we're really representing here. That's why I say it's modeled incorrectly of after you obtain pre-approval of the loan, the implication from a scientific or an exact perspective of how BPMN is written is, as soon as the activity of obtain pre-approval of a loan completes, the next activity of buy a house would be triggered. As soon as you locate a desirable home, the next activity of buy a house would be triggered, and that's really not what's happening. Have a summary slide here. We talked a little bit about last time, again, just reiterating the concept of controlled versus uncontrolled flow. And for novice practitioners, I highly recommend that you use the gateway, you use a controlled flow so that you don't have unintended consequences. As your organization grows and evolves, and sometimes there's just a desire to keep the diagram cleaner, you can eliminate the use of them, but more often than not, I see that there's unintended consequences and miscommunication of the accuracy of the process. Just as a quick summary here, again, the gateways can be used as both splits as well as merges. So when we're talking about splits, there is a unique shape set here, the most common being the exclusive gateway, the inclusive gateway, or the parallel gateway. Occasionally I do see event gateways, and again, as I referenced last time, it's kind of hard to talk about event gateways when you don't know about events. So as we go through this session here today, I think that'll become clear of how and why those are used. From a merges perspective, again, similar symbol set here, although you'll see that there's an additional parallel and event symbol that's used. I've thrown in the slides that we went through last time. Again, as Dan referenced, this will be posted, but just to remind you, from the exclusive gateways, we're talking about one path is taken at the exclusion of all others. Most of the time you're going to have a data gateway, but when you're talking about an event gateway, the external events are actually what's making the choice as which process path you follow. It's whichever event happens first at the exclusion of all others. Exclusive versus inclusive, again, real quick. An exclusive gateway is where one condition is evaluated to see if it's true, An inclusive gateway would be the same thing as having a parallel gateway going to multiple exclusive gateways where multiple conditions are evaluated. It is a way to, again, clean up your diagram and make it a little bit easier to read. The key difference between the two is one condition versus multiple conditions. So with that, I'm going to go ahead into BPMN Events. An event is represented by a circle in the notation itself. It's an indication that something has happened during a process. It can be internally caused or externally caused. Examples are the process starts and ends, a message arrived, events I've also seen used to notate a milestone or a change of state. Events can be placed in sequence flow, which is also called standalone. So you see here you have an process flow going into and out of an event. You can also see an event mounted to the boundary of an activity there. And in that case, it's more of an interrupt or an error or exception that's happening. The key thing here is when an event is mounted to an activity, it's a signal that the task to which it's attached to can be interrupted and the process flow redirected, but the event itself is only going to be picked up if that task is where you're at in the process at the time it occurs. So if you think about it, if you're coming along into task 1 here, and if task 1 completes successfully going to task 2, the message basically isn't going to be received. There's nothing there to catch the message anymore because the token has moved on. Versus if you're doing task 1 and work is in process, if a message is received while you're doing work, the receipt of the message means you stop doing task 1, you don't go to task 2, but you're going to stop doing task 1 and redirect and maybe go to task 3 and do some exception handling or some other activity. Okay, a key thing with the notation is events representing whether it's the start, intermediate, or end. A start means it's actually starting the process. It's a single thin line circle. An intermediate event is a double thin line, and that's something that occurs during the process. Intermediate events are going to have process flow going into and coming out of, or will be your boundary condition, whereas a start event, you're only going to have process flow coming out of it. Think about it, that makes sense. The start event would never have process flow going into it, otherwise it wouldn't really be the true start of a process. The end event is represented by a bold circle, and that's a signal that there is an end to the process. From an intermediate perspective, with all of the events, you'll see that sometimes they're black, colored in. Other times they're an outline or no fill into it. There is a meaning behind that. The black is indicating that it is a throw or send event, meaning that the process itself is causing that event to happen. And as soon as the token reaches that event, there is no delay. It's going to be sending a message or sending a signal, and then you go immediately on. Versus when you're catching an event, that's more the implication that you're waiting for the event to happen, and your process is stuck. You're in the delay. You're waiting until that event happens, and as soon as that event happens, your token will move on and go on to the next activity. The icon that's inside of the circle represents the different event types, which could be referred to as a trigger or a result for the start and end. So from a BPMN perspective, again, start events, this is what's generating your token. When you start your process, as you're walking through a process model, I use the concept of a token from a business analysis perspective to help me, again, keep track of the accuracy of what's really going on, what's happening in parallel, what's happening in sequence, how am I splitting at my OR conditions, and then when I get to a condition that has to have multiple prerequisites, am I waiting for everything to happen? When you're modeling in an executive environment, the token is definitely much more than a theoretical concept, and it's actually what's being generated and telling the system which tasks or which user interface to go ahead and create, which service calls to create. So when a process starts, that's when the token is created. All start events have to be catches. They're all going to be the white outline for that. And I think that makes sense here. You have to wait for something to happen to trigger you to begin work, or you can have a none event in which a user is responsible for triggering the work. If there is no start event that is modeled, again, BPMN allows multiple ways to model things. A start event is not actually required on a diagram. However, again, it is highly recommended. If there is no start event, then that means that any other element that is on your diagram, whether that's a gateway, a task, sub-processes, any element that doesn't have incoming sequence flow is going to actually act as a start. And again, I don't recommend it. It's a lot easier to identify where the circles are in your diagram and making sure that you have that accuracy represented, that other people aren't going to interpret that you've actually got 3 activities all starting at once. Multiple start events can be used. You can have a start event preceded by a merge or gateway, so you can have multiple different types of start required before the very first activity begins. BPMN itself as a notation says you don't have to use a start event, but if you do use one, we also need you to use an end event. But the start and end events go hand in hand together. From a English perspective of what are your subject matter experts going to use, a lot of times they don't. They just know that they do your work. And I think as you know, a process specialist, as you're eliciting requirements out of them, that's what you want to ask them. How do you know you need to work? How do you know that you've got to pick up and do something? Sometimes it's paper coming across their desk. Sometimes it's an email. Sometimes it's more of they just come in and they start their day. So you may have to elicit that a little bit more. From a start perspective, a none or a no specific start is just a blank circle with no picture inside of it. Messages, from a BPMN perspective, again, the notation is written both to support the business and the technology side. From a business process specialist, I'll still use a message as a start event to indicate that the user receives an email or the user receives a request from a client. Whereas when you're modeling an execution environment, messages usually refer to a system-generated message, whether it's a service call or it's the process talking to itself or other processes that are in the application environment. So that's a little bit, I think, of a best practice, or depends on where your organization is at or how you're modeling as to whether you use a none or a message event. A timer refers to a specific date or time or a specific duration. If you think about it, every April 15th, we all have to file taxes. Timer may be an appropriate use for an example like that. The conditional symbol is used when a particular condition is reached. Again, that's usually going to be more applicable in a executable environment, but if you think about it, you've basically got some system or something that's continually monitoring to say, are we done yet? Are we done yet? Have we reached this condition yet? You know, have we reached a threshold? So you preheat your oven and your oven is continually monitoring itself. There's a thermostat in there. When you reach your preset temperature, the timer goes off. That's the type of conditional event. Your temperature, your desired temperature is reached. A signal is a triangle shape. It's a signal broadcast event. This is one that I don't see in practice all that often, and I've not seen it in the executable space at all yet. But the difference between that and a message is more generic in that the signal is available for anyone and everyone to hear it. It doesn't necessarily mean that every process is going to start when the signal goes off. Only the processes that are watching for that signal will be triggered when the signal does go off. You've got multiple and parallel multiple as a symbol. These, again, I don't see a whole lot in practice, and similar to the complex event gateway, instead of using the multiple gateway here being a generic one that would require text annotation to say what all of the multiple triggers are, I would recommend using specific BPMN starts that all go into a gateway join that shows a little bit clearer exactly what it is you're waiting for, what all those multiple events are before the process can start. End events, you'll see here there's a bigger difference than there were with gateways. There's different symbols for starts than there are for ends. There is some commonality or overlap. The none and the message are very similar for end events, no specific results. And in this case, instead of receiving a message, the process is over when a message is sent. We also have an error condition, and error is generated usually within a sub-process. It can be, I guess, at a higher level or process level. But as we get into the intermediate events, and then as we get into sub-processes in the next time, I think that this will become clear how the errors work. Cancel and compensation are also different types of end events. These are, again, primarily used in an executable environment. They tend to be a lot more complex to try to use from a process specialist or business analyst perspective. This is when two things are happening in parallel. I think a lot of the traditional examples are like when you're booking things via credit card and you have to undo things. You've got debits and credits in a book of records going on at the same time. That's when you're going to see compensation, reverse, and undo activities being done. I would equate those, the reason those are in gray is because, one, I don't see them all that often. I'm trying to show you what's used a lot more often than others, as well as what represents more of complex. So my goal here with these webinars is to kind of get you through elementary school, whereas compensation, I would say, is much more of the high school or PhD level of process modeling at this point. So we'll leave that for more of the technical modelers to get into. A terminate event, there's a difference between a terminate and an end event. Terminate means that if you've got a process where you've got parallel activities going on, and if you've got 2 or 3 parallel flows, and something happens in one of those flows where the entire process should be terminated, those other activities should stop and end, that's when you want to use a terminate event. One of the big things I see is people using a terminate inappropriately. The thing to remember is terminate is more appropriate to use when you have parallel flows going on and you want to end the whole thing. Don't get into bad habits of using a terminate when you don't have parallel flows and you don't want to terminate the entire process instance. Escalation is a symbol that's used, again, specific to the end events. An escalation is a little bit different than a message in that you are notifying, you want someone else to be notified, you're sending a message to it. There is another event elsewhere that's going to catch it. Other active threads in the process are going to continue. The key thing with escalate is that it's actually not going to interrupt. So this concept of throwing and catching between end events and boundary conditions, again, we're going to have to build upon each other and come back and revisit this when we actually get into sub-processes in the third webinar. So let's talk a little bit about intermediate events. Going back to a couple slides ago, we've got a normal sequence flow, which means the event is always going to happen. Task 2 complete, my token's going to stop and it's going to wait until this message is received. If this message is never ever received, that message is never sent, task 3 is never ever going to begin. Every process, I'm going to have to expect this message to be generated and received in order for my process to complete. A boundary condition event means that it sometimes happens. When it does happen, I want to redirect my flow. I want to interrupt my normal work from happening, and I want to do something else instead. When we talk about the standalone intermediate events, there are, again, a subset of symbols, none, a plain circle. I would put those in my process model from a business analysis perspective, is again circles versus gateways, and the diamonds and the squares of tasks are easy for the human eye to spot. I may use those to represent a milestone, and talking with business users, they want to know, like, okay, when am I, where am I at in the process? I may throw in a couple of none events. It's not impacting my process flow. There's no waits or delays. It's just a visual use. Messages, send and receive, are both used, I think, fairly often. From, again, a business analysis perspective, I may use those to represent the receiving of an email or receiving replies, phone calls, faxes, snail mail from business partners. From a modeling from execution perspective, there's a slight nuance and connotation, again, that the system's actually sending and receiving messages from itself. Timers do act as delays. The thing with the timer is that the timer doesn't start until the token reaches it. So let's say you had a timer set for a specific date, like April 15th. If your process didn't start until April 16th, and you got to the timer event on April 16th, you're going to sit there and wait there a whole year until the calendar flips to the next April 15th availability. Duration and cycle is something that I see more often from an intermediate of, I get to a certain point in my process and now I need to wait for 4 hours. That's the SLA of my batch job or something like that before I need to move on. Here you see the other escalation. The difference here between the end event and the intermediate is just where you're at in the process. Conditional, again, very similar to a start event. It's going to act as a wait. We're going to have a condition, wait for the condition to become true. As soon as the condition becomes true, the token moves along and the next activities can occur. We've got these arrows here, both a throw and a catch of a link. These actually are used to represent a line break in your connection flow. So if you think about, you've got a process flow that's got, either it starts to get really big and complex, or when you've got your swim lanes that are modeled and you can never have all of your swim lanes all touching each other, so you don't want to have too many lines crossing and trying to keep track of where your connection flows are going. You can use a line break, and that's what the link events will do. They can be on page, or they can say, okay, I need to go to another page of my diagram. It's just used to clean up your process models when you're in a business analysis environment. Signals, they can be both throw or catch. One is firing the signal. The catch is I happen to be the one who is going to respond when I see the signal, and I'm going to do something about it. Examples of signals might be like in a more of a factory environment where you've got the just in time. You've got the lights go off. When the lights go off, you've got a runner coming over to bring you new parts. Flare guns going off in the sky are another example, and hopefully you've got someone who's watching and is going to start their activities and their process when they see the signal being sent. So some of the key words to listen for is milestone. Some business users talk in those, but I think it's milestone and status tend to mean the same thing. Notify, confirm, wait, receives, escalates, until. Those are all words that kind of point to me that there's an event that's going on. Okay. So when we talk about the intermediate events, again, these represent an interruption to an activity most of the time. So again, compensation and escalation being a little bit unique flavors of an intermediate where they actually won't interrupt the activity from occurring. But all the other intermediate shapes interrupt it. So in my example at the bottom here of building a house, if a change request is received, you know, if you're building a house and you want to, hey, wait a minute, I think I actually want to add a second floor on, the builder's got to halt the workers before they put the roof on the first floor, evaluate the request, and then go on. So the actual concept of building the house gets interrupted or paused for a while the request is evaluated, and then once the request is approved, they go back to building the house. You know, the implication here, the way I have it drawn, is that as soon as my change request to add a second floor is, they start to build the house, they're almost starting from scratch and building all over again. So you need to think about what the science of the sequence flow means and where you're coming back to when you're interrupting and redirecting, when you evaluate the request, and if it gets approved, are you going to start building the house from scratch again, or do you need to go to a different activity of continue on? You have to think about that. It's a lot more relevant when you're in the executional environment and re-triggering service calls and automated activities, or you're triggering user interfaces to users to start activities. Key thing is a race condition does occur. So again, when I'm building the house, if the change request comes in while I'm building the house, I can respond to it. Now, if I complete building a house and the house is already built, it doesn't matter how many change requests I submit, the house is already built. The builder is going to ignore it, and there's no change request that's going to occur. Again, when you think about it in an executional environment, you know, I like to think about Amazon a lot, and I think about every time I place an order there, I place one order that has 10 line items on it. As soon as they prepare my shipment and they ship it, I can no longer submit requests, versus if they send me a box, sometimes they break it down into multiple boxes, and if I get 5 of my items today, but my other 5 are on back order, the other 5 that are on back order, I still have the opportunity to go in and say, cancel those 5, they're not coming in time, I don't want the back order type of thing. So the intermediate event types that can be mounted to an activity, they all have to be catched, and you'll notice that's a big difference between the standalone events, intermediate events. They can be both catch or throw. These all have to be catched. There has to be something that's triggering that interrupt to occur. By far, I think the most common is message. That's true both in a modeling for analysis as well as from an executable perspective. The receipt of a message is going to interrupt an activity. Timers you can use as an interrupt. I've yet to see a timer in a real-life experience of why I would want to interrupt and redirect. Most of your workflow or process tools have service level agreements into it. The key thing with service level agreements is if your activity doesn't complete within its specified time, it doesn't you usually don't want to interrupt that activity from occurring. You want it to keep happening. You don't want your worker to stop. You want them to keep doing their work, but you want to have a notice. So that's where you'll see the escalations occur. And most of the BPM systems have kind of inherent escalation built into it, and you don't need to specifically model it. However, if you're not using an executable tool, you may want to think about using an escalation in terms of modeling with analysis. Ask your users, what happens when you don't get something completed in time? What do you want to have happen? Do you want to interrupt activities or not? Do you want to notify people? So again, this is where I think learning the richness of this process modeling notation helped me become a better business analyst as I learned about what these symbols meant. An error is a catch event. The only time that you'll see an error be a catch event is when it's mounted as an intermediate activity, mounted to an activity. And again, when an error occurs, that activity is automatically going to be interrupted. You do want to redirect. You want to have something go to your support team or a manager, someone to look into something and find out why that error was occurred and address it. Cancel, compensation, and the multiple, again, I have grayed out, being a little bit more rare, to say the least, as well as more unique to the executable environment. Then conditions and signals, we've talked about those before. Condition becomes true, redirect. If the signal goes off, if the signal is received, you redirect. Okay, so just a little bit more detail about timer events in practice. As I mentioned earlier, if you're going to use something that represents a recurring date, you really have to be careful of how it's set every January 1st. If that's when it's set for, you have your next process, your next order received on January 2nd, things are going to be delayed an awfully long time. So be very cautious about regularly recurring dates and how those are set. Durations, I think, are a little bit more straightforward and less of a concern, but again, the duration doesn't start until the token arrives. So if you've got an event that's between activities, as soon as the first activity completes, you go to the timer event, that's when the timer starts counting down, and then the next activity won't happen until the timer goes off. Timers are exact. Again, I think about it from you're going to have a system actually counting down January 1st. As soon as the clock hits midnight, it's January 1st. That's when it's going to go off. A lot of times I'll see business analysts new to BPMN for the first time who will start to use timers when it used to be a judgment call. And I would not use a timer for that. I would use a gateway to represent it if it's a personal judgment call. Timers are not necessarily delays that are due to bad process design. If you're looking at an as-is model that has a timer into it, it's not representative of a delay necessarily. With that, I'll speak a little tongue-in-cheek again. Sometimes we've got system constraints that drive our processes, and a lot of times timers will be a sign of a system constraint due to legacy batch jobs or that type of thing. Message events, again, the difference of modeling for analysis versus execution. And on the analysis side, I'll use a message event to represent any type of communication, whether it's a phone call, email, spam out, could be a doorbell. But when you're talking about modeling and execution, messages are going to be used to represent service calls and the process communicating or talking back and forth to each other. Especially when you have big processes in an execution event. In an executional environment, messages are almost like those line breaks of it's a way for parallel processes or multiple instances to share and communicate status to each other. It's something that's the IT side of the house is probably a little bit more familiar with, but I think it's important and it's powerful to understand in the context of multiple instances, which we'll build upon in our third session. Oftentimes when it comes from modeling for analysis, I get asked, well, why would you use an event versus maybe an activity to do something? And that's really, I think, up to the user and, I guess, individual centers of excellence of how and why you're modeling. I would generally use a message event for an email or something like that. If it's pretty quick, it's easy to send, it doesn't seem to be an issue. I might use an activity to say send or notify instead of a message event if it's requiring a lot more work, if that's where pain points are happening. But that's, I think, really up to centers of excellence to figure out what they prefer or recommend. A lot of times I like the ease of using a message event for analysis just because it's actually a space saver in my process flow, and most of my processes that I'm analyzing tend to be pretty big and complex. Okay, so let's go back to the concept of an event gateway, which we talked about last session here, where the gateway is the flow that's coming out of it is based on which event happens first. So my upper left of the screen, this is what I would consider as how I used to model things. I say, okay, I got to prepare documents. I'm going to send them to the lawyer. I'm going to send them to my customer, and then they're going to review and confirm it and maybe get back to me, and we'll go on my way. If I think about using events to identify process delays, I'm the one who's preparing the documents. I need to send it to the client so I can prepare and send it to the client, but I need to stop and wait to receive it back. If I have an activity on the left, it's almost like that activity should belong in another swim lane where some other user is reviewing and confirming it. A lot of times we're communicating with people outside of our organizations. We're communicating with a customer, we're communicating with a supplier, where we have to wait to receive those signed documents back. And by using a message here, I know that if I don't receive that message, I'm not going on. So for me, it was another reason why I'll use messages for modeling for analysis is that visual cue of, well, maybe this is bad process design. What do I do if I never get it back? Do I just ignore it, forget about it? How do I remember that I need to come back to it? And that's where a lot of the pain points of businesses are, and maybe the case for using a workflow type tool is because I can send the documents today, and maybe I send them via email. I gotta like write my little yellow sticky note, or I have to set a reminder for myself in Outlook if I don't hear back from these guys within 2 weeks to say what's going on, and I've got to chase it. When I start to model it as a instead of activities, you know, going down to the bottom line here, I have prepared documents. I send it to the client. After I send it to the client, now I have to wait for it. But if I don't receive that message of the signed documents back, if I have the system set an SLA timer, that can automatically remind me that I need to contact the customer and follow up with them. So that's a little bit more about being more proactive and having the system support users rather than having them to have to manually set the timers and stuff themselves, or to not follow up, which happens all the time too, because people are just running around trying to stay focused on things. They don't have time to set their alarms in Outlook or keep their little yellow sticky notes updated. So I think that's, you know, again, another case of how I would model it for analysis. This is not necessarily how it would get modeled if you're using an executable environment. Again, the message is there. I don't know that I would have my client sending me back a service call. Sometimes as we get more involved with the B2B space, that becomes a little bit more common over the years. But just note that there's a difference between modeling for analysis versus execution. I'm going to talk a little bit about the error handling. We saw the error message event earlier. I'm sorry, the error throwing and catching event. And I get questions asked a lot of, well, why do you have to model errors as a throwing and a catching in this interrupt condition? Again, it comes back to the science of BPMN, and having activity A complete successfully means that I'm going on to my gateway over here in the upper left. If activity A never completes successfully, I never get to the point of checking to see if it's okay. If I'm stuck here in my activity A, I don't have enough information or anything like that, I'm never reaching the endpoint. So this diagram is almost the same as this, but the difference is from a scientific perspective. And again, if I think about trying to articulate what the business means and how developers and IT coders are responding to things, I'd like to think that most people kind of understand this, but there is a slight nuance to it. So if activity A is going on, within activity A, if I put activity A as a sub-process where activity A really entails A1, A2, A3, A4, and A5, if an error occurs here after activity A4, maybe activity A4 is where I say, that's where I'm doing my data validation. Do I have all the data that I need? Did the client pass their credit check? If the answer is no, I would throw an error and interrupt activity A. So A2 and A3 may be still happening in parallel. I want to notify other users who are working on those other activities there to stop what they're doing. We haven't passed the credit check yet. I want to interrupt, redirect activity, go to activity C, and A2 and A3 never complete successfully. Versus if A2, A3, A4, and A5 all complete successfully, I would just go straight to activity B and skip activity C. So as we talk about the science versus the art, some people like flattened diagrams, some people like to see it all on one piece of paper. If it's a big, ugly diagram, at least they can understand it and see that it's a big, ugly process, and they can visualize it. Other people like to have sub-process and drill things, tidy things up, and high level, my process is only 5 activities. If I drill down into the details, I can see what's behind it. So this is where we start to bridge on the science versus the art, multiple ways of doing things. Just know who your audience is and know what your intentions behind your process modeling are. I have a couple of other examples here with the errors and the concept of a terminate. So again, my example of buying a home, if I'm obtaining a home inspection and I get too many errors, I want to terminate the whole process. I'm going to tell these other people to stop doing what they're doing. That terminate is basically going to kill all of those tasks from happening, versus a standalone event would let them keep occurring. So I've got a couple examples here. I think we've got about 10 minutes that I can use this to be a little bit interactive. Or if we've got questions, Laura, I don't know if you've seen any questions pop up to date. Laura?
Sorry about that. I was on mute. Can you hear me now?
Yes, I can.
Okay, perfect. There was one question. We had a couple questions about some feedback, but we may have gotten that taken care of.
Okay.
There was one a few minutes ago about this. It looks like sub-processes were being shown as activities.
Yeah, and I'll probably defer that one to our November session. It's a lot to get into of sub-processes and activities. Again, BPMN, we build upon solid foundations. A lot of events the error conditions and the boundary conditions really require you to know sub-processes as well. So that's something that I personally would like to defer until we get to that next level. We'll come back to it and build upon that in November.
Okay, and also we had a question about us being able to obtain a soft copy of the presentation. Would you make those slides available that we can send out to the attendees, or that's entirely up to you?
Nope, absolutely.
Okay.
We'll make those available. Okay, so just to go, I'll go real quickly through some of these exercises, and then we can open it up for dialogue. And then I actually do have a hard stop at 3 o'clock. So if anyone does have a question, if you could raise it using the instant message feature now, Laura will help facilitate that. And if I do not get through everything, please reach out to me via LinkedIn. I'd be happy to answer any questions that you have, talk to you a little bit offline, and then we can also address things at our third session in November. So while we're waiting for that, coming back here, just quick examples here. The customer submits an order to the company.com website. Company.com is filling the order. A start event to use. Over here. I would recommend using that as a message event, especially with an online company. You're sending a message to their order fulfillment systems. Here's my order, please go process it. From the old school days, your message could be a mailed order form. It could be a phone call. You arrive at work on Monday. You begin analyzing data from a report that was generated last week. It's an example of a non-start event. It's a non-start event because if you didn't arrive at work on Monday, you're taken off this week, or you have a sick day, you're on vacation, it's not going to happen until you come back. It doesn't matter when the report was generated. The report itself being generated was not triggering you to do your work. You've got a million other things to do. What's triggering you to do your work is for you to actually pick it up and care about it. Business days before the end of the month, the batch job starts preparing sales data for financial reports. I think is an excellent use of a timer. Balance on your corporate card reaches $20,000. You and your manager receive notices that you're no longer to make any more purchases. It's an example of a condition becoming true. It doesn't matter if it was one transaction for $20,000 or if you had like $19,999 on your card for the last 6 months. It's not until you purchase that one additional $+ transaction where the alert's going to go out, cutting off your credit. A message is posted to your corporate website that sign up for a new health program is now open. That's an example of a signal. That message goes out to everybody in the company. Whether you click the link or not is up to you. If you have 50,000 employees clicking that link at the same time, you have 50,000 process instances getting started for registering to join a team. From an end event perspective, parts are delivered to plant, put in a warehouse. There's no end. People do their work. There's no message. There's nothing going off. They're just done with their work. When sales finalizes the quote, the quoting system sends an email to the customer. It would be an example of a message end event. Nothing's going to happen unless that client places an order, in which case I would say they probably are starting a different process of order fulfillment. Sales analyst receives a request for quote. They look up the part, and the part doesn't have a price in the system. I would use an error for that. I think that's a perfect example of when to use an error in modeling for business analysis. You complete an adventure course, you fire a flare up into the sky, letting them know you're ready to be picked up. Hopefully they're watching for your signal and actually come and do that. You place an order, company.com. If one of the items is out of stock and it's not available within a week, you receive an email notification. Okay, I would say that's an escalation there. So you're receiving an email notification that your product is on back order and it's going to be ready for you maybe November 10th, but it doesn't mean that they're canceling the order. They haven't stopped doing what they're doing. It's been escalated to you, so you're aware of it, but they're still continuing on with the process of fulfilling your order.
It looks like we do have another question that just popped up. How
Perfect.
do you model/note business rules? How do you make, well, there's a couple different questions. How do you make provision for missing business rules?
That's a good question. Business rules, how do I model those? I'd almost go back to our last session with gateways, and let me just back up a couple of slides and see if I can get there. Again, when you're talking about business rules are usually used to make decisions, which means it's a gateway. I'm either going to go one way or the other if the business way is true or not. So how I model business rules is there's an activity, whether it's a system activity or a user activity, there's a system activity to evaluate the business rule. So here it's represented as check credit score. I would model the business rule itself as an input into this activity as a data object. And we'll talk about data objects as another BPMN element next week. The process model itself should not have the business rule. There's a difference between the process and the rule. The details of what the rule are, rule analysis is a whole nother field, and I would not try to have my process model, I would not try to document or keep my business rules up to date within a process model. I would refer to them as part of checking the credit score. I need to refer to the credit risk policy or the business rule on credit risk. But that rule is maintained, whether it's maintained in a Word document, a policy statement, or a more formalized rules engine. I might refer to that as Business Rule 01 and let Business Rule 01, whatever that particular rule is, be outside of a process. Was there another question, Laura?
I believe that was it for that person. I have not seen anything else pop up yet in the chat or the questions. Oh, so what if the decision changes into critical risk?
I'm assuming they're talking about this example here. So I have, in this particular example, I'm assuming that my business rule has 3 possible levels. If there is a 4th level of critical risk that is defined, I think that's the key point is the reason you extrapolate your business rules from your process is your rules can change at any and every time. So today, my high risk might be anything, you know, if the user has 400 or less as a credit check, that means they're high risk. Well, tomorrow, high risk might be 500, anyone who has a credit score of 500. It just means that I'm going to have more processes or more users who are directed down this path. And I think that's where process metrics, if you know how many of your clients are being determined high risk, and if you have, you know, almost 90% of your clients determined high risk, I may want to either rethink my customer target base, I may want to rethink what my business rules are, but I think that's where you use process metrics to help you evaluate what your rules are. But to me, it doesn't really matter what the rule is, how it's defined, and I don't know, I might recommend that this person maybe reach to me off-site. I think business rule analysis is almost, like I said, its own separate field from processes.
Okay.
And I have time for a more quick question if there is one, Laura. You said I do have a hard stop, unfortunately, today.
Well, it is 3 o'clock, so I believe that answers the questions.
All right.
So I think, well, if you have time, we can give it just a second to see if anything else pops up, but I believe that's it.
All right. Well, I think at that point I'm going to go ahead and, like I said, if any others.
We do have one more, of course, that just popped up. Which tool do you use to model?
I I've purposely, for this, the point of developing these slides, I've used 3 or 4 different tools so you could kind of see what the difference is. Right now, my tool of choice happens to be Visio, as well as IBM BPM's design environment. We can, again, talk a little bit more about tools in our next session. I do have a placeholder for that, for some best practices in modeling, some things to look for when you're using a tool. All I can say is that all tools have their pluses and minuses, and I haven't found one that meets all of my desired must-haves, if you will. So, and with that, I do have to jump off, so if other questions do come up, Laura, if you can get those to Dan, we'll try to get those ahead of time, and then we do have a November session where we'll try to answer those. And again, people, feel free to locate me on LinkedIn and send me a message that way as well.
All right, thank you very much.
Thank you for hosting. Bye-bye.